There comes a point in your life where you must stop being available for everything and start being responsible for yourself. Because not everything people ask from you is something you are meant to give. And if you don't learn this early, life will teach it to you through exhaustion, betrayal, and regret. You see, one of the greatest mistakes people make is confusing kindness with obligation. Just because you can give something doesn't mean you should. And just because someone asks doesn't mean they are entitled to receive. Wisdom is knowing the difference. There are things in your life that are too valuable, too sacred, too essential to your purpose to be handed out casually. And if you keep giving them away, you will wake up one day feeling empty, used, and disconnected from who you were meant to be. If you truly want to understand the value of your life, you must first understand the value of your time. Because time is not just something you spend, time is something you are made of. Every second that passes is not just movement on a clock, it is a portion of your existence being expressed and never returning again. And yet, one of the greatest failures of human behavior is how casually people give away their time, especially to those who do not respect it. There comes a moment in every serious life where you must confront a hard truth. Not everyone deserves access to you. Not everyone deserves to reach you whenever they feel like it. Not everyone deserves your immediate attention just because they are available and you are reachable. Because accessibility without boundaries leads to exhaustion, and exhaustion leads to a life that looks busy but feels empty. When you are young or unaware of your value, you tend to believe that being available all the time makes you important. You think that quick responses make you reliable and constant presence makes you valuable. But maturity reveals something different. It reveals that unlimited availability does not create respect, it destroys it. People begin to assume your time has no weight, no structure, no priority. And once people assign low value to your time, they will begin to treat your life as if it exists for their convenience. Think about it clearly. Every time your phone rings, every notification that lights up your screen, every message that demands an immediate response is not just communication, it is a request for your life in that moment. Because when you respond, you are not just replying, you are surrendering attention, focus, energy, and mental space. And if you never control that flow, you will find yourself constantly interrupted, constantly distracted, and constantly reacting instead of building. A person who has no control over their time has no control over their destiny. Because destiny is not built in scattered moments of distraction. It is built in protected, intentional focus periods where vision becomes action. And you cannot build anything meaningful if your life is always open for interruption. There is a principle that wise people eventually learn. Availability must be intentional, not automatic. If your presence is always guaranteed, it loses value. If your attention is always accessible, it loses meaning. And if your time is always given freely without thought, it becomes a resource others consume without appreciation. You must begin to see your time as leadership material. In leadership, nothing is random. Every moment is assigned, every action is prioritized, every interruption is evaluated. That is why successful people do not live in reaction to others. They live in alignment with purpose. They do not answer everything immediately. They answer what matters, when it matters, and how it matters. But when you live without boundaries, you allow other people's urgency to become your lifestyle. And most of the time, what others call urgent is not actually important. It is simply convenient for them. And when you constantly respond to convenience, you begin to abandon your own priorities. There is a difference between being helpful and being accessible without limits. Helpfulness is intentional. It is guided by wisdom, timing, and purpose. Unlimited accessibility, on the other hand, is emotional. It is driven by fear of rejection, desire to please, or the need to feel needed. And anything driven by emotion without wisdom eventually becomes self-destructive. You must ask yourself a serious question: who is controlling my schedule? Is it my purpose or is it other people's expectations? Because if your day is always dictated by external demands, you are not living. You are being used by time instead of using time. One of the most powerful disciplines you can develop is the discipline of delay. The ability to not respond immediately. The ability to pause before reacting. The ability to decide when your attention is given. This is not about being rude or disconnected. This is about being intentional with your life. Because every time you respond instantly to everything, you are training people to believe that you exist at their convenience. And once that pattern is established, it becomes becomes harder to reverse. People adjust to how you train them. If you train them that you are always available, they will always expect availability. If you train them that your time is structured, they will begin to respect structure. There is nothing noble about being constantly interrupted. There is nothing admirable about being mentally scattered. And there is nothing successful about being accessible without boundaries. In fact, most burnout in life does not come from lack of ability. It comes from lack of boundaries. You must understand that your attention is your life's currency. Where your attention goes, your energy flows. And where your energy flows, your life develops. So, when you give attention to everything, you are indirectly giving your life away in pieces that never come back together. Think about the modern world. Everything is designed to pull your attention. Messages, calls, notifications, social pressure, expectations. If you do not consciously protect your time, you will wake up one day realizing that you have spent years responding to everything except your own dreams. You will have been present everywhere except in your own purpose. This is why discipline is not just about action. It is about protection. Protecting your focus, protecting your energy, protecting your time. Because what you do not protect, you will lose without realizing it. And what you lose without realizing, you will never easily recover. There is a silent tragedy in many lives. People are always busy but rarely productive. Always available but rarely fulfilled. Always responding but rarely building. And the reason is simple. They never learn to say no to interruption. They never learn to control access. You must be willing to disappoint people in order to develop your life. Because not every expectation placed on you is aligned with your purpose. And not every demand on your time deserves your agreement. Sometimes the most responsible thing you can do is delay access. Not because you do not care, but because you do care about your future enough to protect it. When you begin to value your time, something changes in how people treat you. Some will resist it because they benefited from your lack of boundaries. Others will adjust because they respect structure. And a few will disappear because they were only present for convenience. Chi papa and chi beta party. But that process is not loss, it is clarity. It reveals who values you and who only values access to you. And here is something deeper. People do not respect what is always available. Human psychology is drawn to what is structured, limited, and intentional. When something is always accessible, it becomes common. And what becomes common loses value and perception. That is why even in nature, things of value are often protected, not exposed. You are not meant to be emotionally, mentally, or physically accessible to everyone at all times. You are meant to be available with wisdom, not desperation, with control, not compulsion, with intention, not reaction. So begin to restructure your relationship with time. Stop treating every notification as a command. Stop treating every request as an obligation. Stop treating every person's urgency as your responsibility. Learn to pause. Learn to evaluate. Learn to prioritize, because your future is not built in noise. It is built in focus. And focus cannot survive in a life where access is uncontrolled. If you do not govern your time will govern you. And once time governs you, you become a servant to everyone else's expectations while neglecting your own assignment. The strongest lives are not the most available lives. They are the most disciplined, the most focused, the most intentional. And those lives are built on one foundational truth: not everything deserves access to me. There is a moment in every human life when you must decide who is going to sit in the driver's seat of your existence. Either you will sit there taking responsibility for every turn, every direction, every decision, or you will quietly hand the wheel to other people while convincing yourself that you are still in control. But make no mistake, any life where someone else is deciding your direction is no longer your life. It is a borrowed existence. One of the deepest struggles in human behavior is not lack of intelligence, not lack of opportunity, not even lack of potential. It is the silent surrender of decision-making power. It is when a person slowly, sometimes unknowingly, begins to allow others to define what they should do, who they should become, where they should go, and how they should live. And the most dangerous part is that it rarely happens in one moment. It happens in small agreements, subtle approvals, and repeated compromises. At first, it may seem harmless. Someone gives advice and you accept it. Someone expresses concern and you adjust. Someone insists they know better and you step back. But over time, those small adjustments begin to form a pattern. And that pattern becomes a mindset. And that mindset becomes a lifestyle where your decisions are no longer truly yours. When you give people control over your decisions, you are not just allowing them to influence your actions, you are allowing them to shape your identity. Because every decision you make is connected to who you believe you are. And when someone else begins to decide for you consistently, you slowly begin to lose clarity about your own voice. You start asking more than you decide. You start seeking approval more than direction. And you start doubting your own judgment more than trusting it. There is a difference between receiving guidance and surrendering control. Guidance is information. Control is authority. Guidance says, consider this. Control says, do this. And many people cannot distinguish between the two, so they unintentionally hand over authority over their life while thinking they are simply being respectful or open-minded. But wisdom requires discernment. Not every voice in your life deserves equal authority. Not every opinion deserves equal weight. And not every suggestion deserves execution. You must learn how to filter influence without losing identity. Because if you do not decide for yourself, someone else will decide for you. And they will not always decide in your favor. Sometimes people project their fears onto your future. Sometimes they project their limitations onto your possibilities. Sometimes they project their failures onto your decisions. And if you're not careful, you will begin to live inside the boundaries of someone else's experiences instead of the boundaries of your own potential. There are people who will always see you through the lens of who you used to be. And if you allow them to guide your decisions, they will unconsciously try to keep you in that version of yourself. Not because they hate you, but because familiarity feels safe to them. But your growth will always make some people uncomfortable. And if you depend on their approval to move forward, you will remain stuck in a smaller version of your life. Control over your decisions is one of the most subtle forms of captivity because it does not feel like imprisonment at first. It feels like advice. It feels like care. It feels like protection, but over time, it becomes restriction. And by the time you realize it, your confidence in your own judgment has already weakened. A person who cannot trust their own decisions becomes dependent. And dependence in decision-making creates hesitation. And hesitation creates missed opportunities. And missed opportunities slowly create regret. So what began as just listening to others can eventually lead to a life of delay, confusion, and unfulfilled potential. You must understand that every major direction in your life will require you to stand alone at some point. Not physically alone, but mentally independent. There will always be moments where your decision will not be fully understood by others. If you wait for full understanding and approval before you act, you will delay your destiny indefinitely. Leadership in your own life requires courage. The courage to choose even when voices around you are uncertain. The courage to move even when opinions are divided. And the courage to trust your internal conviction even when external validation is missing. Because if you always need agreement before action, you are not leading your life. You are negotiating it. There is a hidden danger in excessive consultation. When you consult too many voices, you begin to lose clarity. Every person has their own experience, their own bias, their own perspective. And when you mix too many perspectives without internal grounding, you end up with confusion instead of clarity. At some point, you must stop collecting opinions and start developing conviction. Conviction is what allows you to stand firm when pressure increases. It is what gives you stability when circumstances change. And it is what protects your direction when external noise becomes loud. But conviction cannot exist in a mind that is constantly overridden by other people's authority. You are responsible for your decisions, but not everyone is responsible for your consequences. That is a reality many people avoid facing. People will give advice freely, but they will not carry the outcome of your life. They may forget what they told you, but you will live with what you did. So why would you hand over authority to someone who is not accountable for your results? There is a maturity that comes when you realize that even well-meaning people can mislead your direction. Not because they intend harm, but because they are not living your life. life. They are not carrying your calling, your pressure, your opportunities, or your challenges. So their advice is always limited by their perspective. You must learn to honor advice without becoming enslaved by it. Listen without surrendering. Consider without losing yourself. Reflect without abandoning your judgment. Because your life requires personal responsibility. And responsibility means ownership of direction. Ownership means you decide. Ownership means you choose. Ownership means you accept consequences without blaming others for the decisions you made. A person who gives away decision-making power eventually becomes emotionally unstable because they are no longer grounded in their own authority. They begin to feel uncertain, easily influenced, and dependent on external validation. And when things go wrong, they struggle with responsibility because they never fully owned the decision in the first place. But when you reclaim your decision-making power, something changes internally. Confidence begins to grow, clarity begins to return, and direction becomes stronger. Not because everything becomes easy, but because everything becomes yours. Even mistakes become valuable when they are yours, because they teach you directly. But when mistakes are made through someone else's control, the lesson becomes diluted and the growth becomes delayed. You must reach a point where you can say, I will listen, but I will decide. That is not arrogance, that is maturity. That is not rebellion, that is responsibility. That is the difference between a life shaped by influence and a life shaped by purpose. There will always be pressure to conform your decisions to the comfort of others. But comfort is not the measure of truth. Popular opinion is not the measure of destiny. And agreement is not the requirement for direction. You are allowed to think differently. You are allowed to choose differently. And you are allowed to walk paths that others do not understand. But you are not allowed to abandon your authority over your own life. Because the moment you surrender your decisions completely, you begin to lose ownership of your future. And a future without ownership becomes a life of regret disguised as obedience. Take back your authority. Rebuild your trust in your judgment. Strengthen your ability to decide without fear. And remember that your life is too important to be directed by people who are not responsible for its outcome. There is something within every human being that is more valuable than success, more valuable than money, more valuable than recognition, and more valuable than influence. It is something that cannot be measured on a bank statement, cannot be displayed on social media, and cannot be purchased in any marketplace. It is your peace of mind. Yet, paradoxically, it is also the thing people give away the easiest. You can lose money and recover it. You can lose opportunities and create new ones. You can lose relationships and rebuild your life. But when you lose your peace of mind, everything else begins to lose meaning while you are still holding it. Because peace is not just a feeling, it is the internal environment where your thinking, clarity, judgment, and emotional stability live. Without peace, even success feels heavy. Even blessings feel like pressure. Even opportunities feel like burdens. And that is why protecting your peace is not a luxury. It is a necessity for survival, clarity, and purpose. One of the most dangerous things in life is not external conflict, but internal disturbance. External challenges are normal. Problems, disagreements, misunderstandings, and opposition are part of life. But the real danger begins when those external issues are allowed to enter your inner world and take control of your thoughts. You were never designed to carry every conversation, every insult, every opinion, every misunderstanding, or every emotional projection of others. But many people live as if their mind is a public space where everyone is allowed to enter freely, leave noise behind, and disturb the atmosphere. And that is where the breakdown begins. Because when your peace is no longer protected, your mind becomes reactive instead of reflective. You no longer respond with wisdom, you react with emotion. And emotional reactions, when uncontrolled, always lead to regret. There are people who will test your peace not because they are powerful, but because they are unsettled. A disturbed person often tries to disturb others. A confused person often tries to confuse others. A frustrated person often tries to transfer frustration. And if you are not aware of this principle, you will become a storage place for emotions that were never meant to belong to you. You must understand this deeply. Not every battle deserves your participation. Not every opinion deserves your attention. Not every insult deserves your response. Not every disagreement deserves your energy. Because every time you engage unnecessarily, you are exchanging your peace for someone else's chaos. Peace is not maintained by controlling the world around you. Peace is maintained by controlling what the world is allowed to place inside you. There is a difference between what happens around you and what happens within you. You may not always control the external environment, but you always have authority over your internal response if you are disciplined enough to exercise it. But many people lose their peace not because of what happens, but because of how much importance they assign to what happens. They magnify small issues into large emotional burdens. They replay conversations repeatedly in their mind. They imagine worst-case scenarios that have not happened. And in doing so, they create internal storms that reality never demanded. A peaceful mind is not a mind without problems. It is a mind that refuses to be dominated by problem. One of the greatest disciplines you must develop is emotional filtration. Not everything that enters your environment deserves access to your mind. Just like a building has security at the entrance, your thoughts must have security at the gate of your awareness. You must learn to ask, does this deserve to stay in my mind, or does it deserve to be released? Because the human mind is powerful, but it is also vulnerable. Whatever you repeat in your mind becomes amplified in your emotions. Whatever you entertain mentally begins to shape your emotional state. And whatever shapes your emotional state begins to influence your decisions. This is why losing peace is dangerous. It does not stay internal. It spreads outward into your choices, relationships, health, productivity, and future. A disturbed mind cannot make stable decisions. A restless heart cannot recognize opportunity clearly. A chaotic inner world cannot produce consistent results. And yet many people continue to allow their peace to be disrupted daily by things they cannot control and should not carry. You must reach a point in your development where you decide that peace is non-negotiable. Not negotiable with people. Not negotiable with opinions. Not negotiable with circumstances. Not negotiable with emotions that do not serve your purpose. This does not mean ignoring reality. It means refusing to be consumed by it. There is a spiritual and psychological truth here. What you allow to dominate your attention will eventually dominate your experience. If you allow negativity to dominate your attention, your life will feel negative, even in positive environments. If you allow fear to dominate your attention, your decisions will be shaped by fear, even in safe situations. Peace is therefore not the absence of disturbance. It is the presence of control over what disturbance is allowed to influence. One of the greatest threats to peace is unnecessary engagement. There are conversations you should not enter, arguments you should not entertain, opinions you should not absorb, and emotional exchanges you should not participate in, because not every invitation deserves your response. There is wisdom in silence. There is strength in withdrawal. There is maturity in choosing not to react. But the immature mind believes that every statement requires a response, every insult requires defense, and every situation requires immediate involvement. And that mindset destroys peace consistently. A wise person learns the discipline of delay, not reacting immediately, not responding emotionally, not engaging impulsively, because in the space between stimulus and response lies your power to preserve your peace. Another major thief of peace is comparison. When you constantly measure your life against others, you create internal dissatisfaction even when nothing is wrong. You begin to question your progress, your timing, your value, and your direction based on someone else's journey. And comparison always produces disturbance because it removes gratitude and replaces it with pressure. Peace cannot exist where comparison is constant, because comparison always creates a false standard that your life was never designed to meet. You must understand that your peace is connected to your focus, and your focus determines your emotional climate. If your focus is scattered across other people's lives, opinions, and expectations, your peace will always be unstable. There is also a hidden thief of peace called over-responsibility. This is when you begin to feel responsible for everything and everyone. You carry emotional burdens that are not yours. You absorb problems that are not assigned to you. And you internalize stress that you were never meant to manage. But wisdom teaches boundaries. You can care without carrying. freeing. You can love without absorbing. You can support without losing yourself. Because if you become responsible for everything, you will eventually lose control over yourself. And when you lose control over yourself, peace disappears. Peace is also threatened by unresolved emotional baggage. When people refuse to process their past, they carry it into their present. Old wounds become new triggers. Past failures become current fears. Previous betrayals become present suspicion. And the mind never fully rests because it is always reacting to what is no longer happening. Healing is not optional if peace is the goal, because unhealed emotions always demand attention in the form of disturbance. But there is also a higher level of peace that many people never access, the peace that comes from alignment. When your life is aligned with purpose, your inner world begins to stabilize even in external chaos. Because you are no longer reacting randomly, you are living intentionally. Purpose brings direction. Direction brings focus. Focus brings clarity. And clarity protects peace. When you know why you are doing what you are doing, you are less disturbed by what others are doing. You must also learn this truth. Peace is protected by boundaries. Boundaries are not walls to keep people out. They are structures that keep your life stable. Without boundaries, everything enters. Opinions enter. Negativity enters. Emotional pressure enters. And soon your inner world becomes overcrowded. But with boundaries, you decide what has access and what does not. You decide what stays and what leaves. You decide what influences you and what does not. And that decision is what preserves peace. At a deeper level, peace is not something you find. It is something you protect. It is not given by people, and it is not taken by people unless you allow it. It is a responsibility, a discipline, a mindset. So you must become intentional about guarding it. Because once your peace is gone, even your blessings feel heavy. Even your achievements feel empty. Even your relationships feel stressful. But when your peace is intact, even challenges feel manageable. Even delays feel tolerable. And even uncertainty feels bearable. Protect your peace like your future depends on it, because it does. There is something inside every human being that silently shapes how they live, how they walk, how they speak, and how they carry themselves through the world. It is not their appearance, not their possessions, and not even their achievements. It is something deeper, something invisible, but extremely powerful. It is their self-worth. And yet it is also one of the easiest things to give away without even realizing it. Self-worth is not destroyed in one moment. It is slowly eroded through repeated exposure to voices, experiences, and environments that subtly tell you that you are less than you truly are. And if you are not careful, you begin to internalize those messages. You begin to believe what was never meant to define you. And gradually, you start living below your true value while still carrying the potential of greatness within you. This is why protecting your self-worth is not optional. It is essential for a meaningful life. One of the greatest mistakes people make is assuming that other people have the authority to define their value. They allow approval to become identity. They allow criticism to become truth. They allow rejection to become conclusion. And slowly, without realizing it, they begin to outsource their worth to external validation. But your worth was never meant to be voted on by people. It was never meant to rise and fall based on opinions. It was never designed to be negotiated in conversations or determined by acceptance or rejection. Your worth is intrinsic. It exists because you exist. However, understanding this intellectually is not enough, because life constantly tests this truth through experiences that challenge your identity. There will always be voices in the world that try to assign you a lower value than what you carry. Some of these voices are loud and obvious. Others are subtle and disguised as advice, concern, or even humor. But whether loud or subtle, the message is often the same. You are not enough, you are not capable, you are not important, or you are not worthy. And if you do not guard your inner world, those external messages begin to become internal beliefs. This is where the danger begins, not when people speak, but when you start believing what they say. Because once a belief takes root in your identity, it begins to influence your behavior. You start shrinking your presence in spaces where you should stand confidently. You start avoiding avoiding opportunities that require boldness. You start tolerating treatment that does not reflect your value. And you start questioning your own potential even when evidence of your capability exists. Self-worth is the foundation of every decision you make about yourself. When your self-worth is strong, your decisions reflect confidence, clarity, and dignity. When your self-worth is weak, your decisions reflect fear, insecurity, and dependency. This is why protecting it is critical. There are environments that quietly erode self-worth without direct confrontation. Environments where your ideas are constantly dismissed. Environments where your efforts are never acknowledged. Environments where your presence is tolerated but not valued. And if you stay in such environments long enough without awareness, you begin to adapt to the level of value assigned to you there. But adaptation does not always mean truth. Sometimes it simply means survival. You begin to behave in ways that match how you are treated, not how you are meant to be treated. And that is how identity distortion begins. There is also a powerful internal threat to self-worth: comparison. When you compare yourself to others, you are not measuring truth, you are measuring perception. And perception is always incomplete. You see someone's success but not their struggle. You see someone's confidence but not their insecurity. You see someone's achievement but not their process. Yet comparison makes you judge your entire life based on incomplete information about someone else's life. And in that distorted comparison, you often conclude that you are behind, less capable, or less valuable. But that conclusion is not truth, it is distortion. Self-worth cannot survive in an environment of constant comparison because comparison always produces inadequacy. It shifts your focus from who you are to who you are not. And the more you focus on what you are not, the less you appreciate what you are. Another silent destroyer of self-worth is rejection. When people are rejected, especially repeatedly, they begin to question their value. They start believing that rejection is proof of deficiency. But rejection is not always a reflection of worth. It is often a reflection of alignment, timing, preference, or circumstance. Not being chosen does not mean you are not valuable. Not being accepted does not mean you are not worthy. Not being recognized does not mean you are not significant. But when self-worth is not grounded, rejection feels like identity instead of experience. And this is where people begin to compromise themselves. They start changing who they are to be accepted. They start lowering their standards to be included. They start hiding their authenticity to avoid disapproval. And in doing so, they slowly disconnect from their true identity just to maintain external acceptance. But acceptance that requires you to abandon yourself is not acceptance. It is conditional approval. And conditional approval is unstable because it changes based on expectations that you did not set and cannot always meet. Self-worth requires the courage to remain yourself even when it costs you approval. There is also a deeper level where self-worth is attacked through words. Words have the power to shape internal identity, especially when repeated or spoken by influential figures. A single negative statement, if repeated often enough or believed deeply enough, can become an internal script that influences how you see yourself. But you must learn this truth. Words are not identity. They are expressions of perspective. People speak from their limitations, their experiences, their wounds, and their biases. And if you allow every word spoken about you to become truth within you, you will live under identities that were never yours. This is why discernment is necessary. Not every opinion deserves internal residence. Not every criticism deserves emotional storage. And not every label deserves acceptance. You must develop the ability to hear without absorbing, to listen without internalizing, and to observe without agreeing. Self-worth is also deeply affected by failure. When people fail, they often assume that failure is proof of inadequacy. But failure is not identity, it is feedback. It is information about what did not work, not a declaration of who you are. However, without strong self-worth, failure becomes personal condemnation instead of practical learning. And when failure becomes identity, fear increases, risk decreases, and growth slows down. A strong sense of self-worth allows you to fail without collapsing. It allows you to learn without shame. It allows you to grow without self-condemnation. Because your value is not determined by your outcomes, it is determined by your existence. There's also a subtle but dangerous pattern. People begin to associate their worth with productivity. They feel valuable only when they are achieving, producing, or performing. And when they are resting, recovering, or still, they feel worthless. But your value is not transactional. You are not more valuable when you are producing and less valuable when you are resting. You are valuable because of who you are, not only because of what you do. When self-worth becomes dependent on performance, life becomes exhausting. Because you are constantly trying to earn something that was never meant to be earned. You must also recognize that some people will unconsciously benefit from your low self-worth. Because when you see yourself as less, you accept less. You tolerate more. You demand less. And you become easier to influence, control, or overlook. But when self-worth is strong, your standards rise. Your boundaries become clear. Your decisions become intentional. And your presence becomes more grounded. This is why self-worth is often challenged when you begin to grow. Because growth threatens systems that depend on your insecurity. But you cannot build a meaningful life while constantly doubting your value. At its core, self-worth is not arrogance. It is awareness. It is the recognition that your life has meaning, your existence has value, and your presence has significance regardless of external validation. Protecting it means refusing to accept definitions of yourself that contradict your inherent value. It means refusing to shrink to fit environments that cannot recognize your full expression. It means refusing to abandon yourself for the comfort of others. Because the moment you give people authority over your self-worth, you begin to live from their perception instead of your truth. And a life lived from external perception is always unstable because perception changes. But when your self-worth is grounded internally, you become stable even when external conditions fluctuate. So you must guard it carefully. Do not allow rejection to redefine you. Do not allow criticism to diminish you. Do not allow comparison to confuse you. And do not allow environments to condition you into believing you are less than what you truly are. Because once self-worth is lost, everything else becomes negotiable. But when self-worth is strong, everything else becomes aligned. There is something sacred within every human being that very few people ever fully understand, and even fewer ever protect. It is not just ambition, it is not just talent, and it is not just potential. It is something deeper, something that defines the reason you exist in the first place. It is your purpose. And the most dangerous thing you can ever do in your life is to give that purpose away. Not always intentionally, not always consciously, but slowly through distraction, through pressure, through comparison, through obligation, and through the constant demand of other people's expectations. You begin to drift away from what you were meant to do. And without realizing it, you start living a life that looks active on the outside but is disconnected on the inside. Purpose is not just what you do. Purpose is the internal direction that gives meaning to everything you do. It is the alignment between your existence and your contribution. It is the invisible force that makes your life feel intentional instead of accidental. But when purpose is not guarded, it becomes the easiest thing to lose in a distracted world. Because distractions rarely come dressed as destruction. They come dressed as opportunities, responsibilities, relationships, emergencies, and even good intentions. And that is what makes them dangerous. Not because they are always bad, but because they are often convincing enough to pull you away from what is best. You do not lose purpose in one decision. You lose it in thousands of small compromises. One delay, one unnecessary yes, one misplaced priority, one moment of distraction that becomes a habit, and slowly your life begins to drift. At first, it does not feel like loss. It feels like busyness. It feels like involvement. It feels like productivity. But inside, something starts to weaken. The clarity of direction begins to fade. The fire begins to dim. The sense of meaning begins to feel distant. And you start wondering why you are doing what you are doing, even though you are doing so much. This is one of the greatest tragedies of modern life. People are more active than ever, but less aligned than ever. More engaged than ever, but less purposeful than ever. More connected than ever, but less fulfilled than ever. Because activity is not the same as purpose. You can be busy and still be lost. You can be surrounded by people and still feel empty. You can be achieving things and still feel disconnected from your true assignment. Because purpose is not measured by motion, it is measured by meaning. When you give people access access to your purpose, you begin to live according to external demands instead of internal direction. And external demands are endless. There will always be something to do, someone to help, something to fix, something to attend, something to respond to. But your purpose is not designed to fit into everything. It is designed to define what matters. One of the most subtle ways people lose their purpose is through responsibility overload. They start carrying things that were never assigned to them. They start solving problems that were never meant for them to solve. They start responding to every request as if every request is equally important. And in doing so, they slowly replace their assignment with distraction. Not every good thing is your thing. Not every need is your responsibility. Not every opportunity is aligned with your direction. But without clarity, everything looks important. And when everything looks important, nothing becomes prioritized. Purpose requires focus, and focus requires elimination. You cannot walk in purpose while trying to do everything, because purpose is not about doing more. It is about doing what matters most with consistency and depth. But distraction thrives in environments where boundaries are weak. When you do not define what is important, the world will define it for you. And the world is always louder than your inner voice if you allow it to be. There is also a deeper issue. People often confuse availability with obligation. Just because you are able to help does not mean you are assigned to help. Just because you can respond does not mean you should respond. Just because something demands attention does not mean it deserves priority. But when purpose is not clear, everything becomes a demand. And soon you find yourself living reactively instead of intentionally. You wake up responding instead of directing. You move based on urgency instead of vision. And you slowly become a servant to external expectations rather than a steward of internal assignment. Purpose is not preserved by accident. It is preserved by discipline. Discipline to say no to distractions. Discipline to delay unnecessary engagement. Discipline to protect your focus even when it is uncomfortable. Discipline to choose alignment over approval. Because every yes to distraction is a no to purpose. Even when it seems small, even when it feels harmless, even when it appears justified. The accumulation of misplaced yeses eventually leads to a misplaced life. There is a stage in life where you must begin to evaluate not just what you are doing, but why you are doing it. Because action without alignment leads to exhaustion, but action with alignment leads to fulfillment. Many people are exhausted not because they are doing too much, but because they are doing too much of what does not matter to their purpose. When purpose is clear, decisions become simpler. You do not need to overthink every opportunity. You do not need to emotionally engage every request. You do not need to be pulled in every direction. You simply ask one question: does this align with where I am supposed to go? If it does not, it becomes noise. But when purpose is unclear, everything becomes confusing. You say yes out of fear of missing out. You say yes out of pressure. You say yes out of guilt. You say yes out of the need to feel useful. And slowly, your life becomes scattered across too many directions with no meaningful progress in any one direction. Purpose requires protection like a valuable treasure because it is one. And anything valuable will always be targeted by distraction. There is a reason why clarity of purpose often comes with solitude, because silence reveals what noise hides. When you remove constant external input, you begin to hear internal direction more clearly. But when your life is constantly filled with noise, opinions, demands, and entertainment, your internal voice becomes harder to hear. And if you cannot hear your direction, you cannot follow it. Another way purpose is lost is through comparison. When you compare your journey to others, you begin to question your timing. You begin to doubt your path. You begin to feel behind or ahead based on someone else's progress. And in that comparison, you may abandon your unique assignment just to imitate someone else's success. But purpose is not competitive. It is individual. It is assigned. It is personal. And it cannot be copied without distortion. You are not behind because someone else is ahead in a different assignment. You are not early because someone else is delayed. You are not late because someone else is ahead. You are simply responsible for your own alignment. When you lose sight of that, distraction becomes more attractive than direction. And there is also emotional distraction, the kind that comes through relationships, obligations, and emotional attachments that pull you away from your focus. Not all emotional connections are aligned with your purpose. Some connections support your growth and others simply consume your attention. But without discernment, emotional pressure can override purpose clarity. You begin to prioritize people over assignment. You begin to prioritize comfort over calling. You begin to prioritize approval over direction. And slowly purpose becomes secondary instead of primary. But your life cannot fulfill its meaning if purpose is not prioritized. There will always be something that demands your attention, but not everything that demands attention deserves your life. And not everything that feels urgent is important to your destiny. Purpose requires the courage to ignore what is loud in order to follow what is true. At a deeper level, purpose is not just about achievement. It is about obedience to your internal design. It is about becoming who you were meant to be, not just doing what is available to do. And when you are aligned with purpose, even simple actions carry meaning. But when you are disconnected from purpose, even major achievements feel empty. That is why some people reach success but still feel lost, because success without purpose is accomplishment without fulfillment. You must guard your purpose the way a builder guards a foundation, because everything you build depends on it. If the foundation is unstable, everything above it becomes unstable. But if the foundation is strong, even pressure cannot destroy what is built on it. So you must learn to protect your direction, protect your focus, protect your priorities, protect your clarity, and protect your assignment from the constant noise of distraction. Because life will always offer you many directions, but only one alignment will bring meaning. And if you give people control over your purpose through pressure, distraction, expectation, or emotional demand, you will eventually wake up realizing that you have been living a life that is full of motion, but empty of meaning. But when you protect it, something powerful happens. Clarity returns, energy becomes focused, decisions become easier, and life begins to feel aligned again. Because purpose, when protected, does not just guide your life, it transforms it.